Hello, so welcome to the first of your mini lecture screencasts that you're going to get from this class. One of the things I want to start off by mentioning here is that these screencasts are designed to be 20 minutes or less going through these chapters, so they're not comprehensive lectures like you would get in class where that would take an hour and 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do with each one of these is hit the high points from each chapter and some of the elements I feel are more crucial for you to be aware of. But it will be your job to go through the ebook or textbook, whichever the one you have, and go through and catch some of the other smaller details and terms. I know that very few of you, if any of you, would sit and watch an hour and a half long lecture, so these are designed to be little recaps going through everything and making sure that we're comfortable with what we're doing. So as we go through, I'm going to be using some of the PowerPoints that I use in some of my live classes. They are not identical to what I normally provide for you all, but what I wanted to show is how some of the group assignments that I give my students you can also do individually on your own, just to kind of get your brain working and focused on what you need to do. So first things first, in a typical class, what I would be doing is getting everybody going by partnering up with someone and writing out an example of when communication didn't go so well for you, and whether that's face-to-face or texting, and then spending a few moments analyzing why you feel that miscommunication happened. And this is something that would still be really beneficial for you all to do on your own. So if you want to, you can just pause me and take a moment to think. When was the time when good communication would have been exceptionally helpful to you, but for some reason that just didn't happen? It could be a texting conversation where you thought somebody was serious, but they just didn't throw that ha-ha emoji in there. It could be a serious conversation with a caretaker or a caregiver or whoever it might be where you just messed up on something you were attempting to communicate. And it also could be something like a relationship argument where it took you 2 hours to figure out that you both wanted the same thing, but the way that you were going about it just didn't come across very well. So feel free to pause me, take 2 or 3 minutes, and kind of figure out an example of communication that really has just bothered you. It could be something recent, or it could be something that's kind of flashing back from middle school where if you could go back and do it differently, you would. So one of the reasons that you are in this particular class and why communication is important is to improve upon and sometimes avoid those miscommunication situations. And one of the reasons that this class is required for a majority of UTSU students is because communication skills benefit you in many more areas than just public speaking. While public speaking will be an element of this class, it will not be the end-all be-all of this class. You do need to know how to speak in front of other people in an organized and professional manner, but you also need to be able to use communication to assist you in other areas. And some of the benefits that you can get from good communication analysis would be problem-solving skills. All of you in your future careers will face situations where good communication would resolve problems. Many of you have probably already been in those situations, just thinking about the example you did on your starter. Of course, communication can assist us with awareness. We do, as a culture, need to be more aware of the diversity amongst all of us and how to communicate across those diversity lines. And as naturally, this would benefit us in relationships. I am married and have been married for several years, and one of the first questions I'm always asked is, well, how does he communicate? You teach communication, so what about him? And my general answer for that one is, since I am the trained professional, I have to take responsibility for the majority of our communication. If something is being miscommunicated, I'm the one that has to look back and see how I contributed to that, and then have an open and honest dialogue with him about what went wrong or what could go wrong and what I meant, and I'll ask him extra questions to make sure I understand him correctly. So generally our communication is pretty good. He's very used to me asking him a lot of questions, though. Of course, communication will assist you in leadership. Good communicators typically are good leaders because they are able to articulate the goals of whatever situation you're in and to be able to communicate effectively with the people underneath their leadership to make the situation beneficial for everyone. Now, the last thing, of course, for this list is presentations, and that could be anything from a public speaking situation to a keynote presentation at a conference, or it could be something like what I'm doing right now, which is a screencast. I might not see you at the same time that I'm talking, but I still have to make sure that my voice is active, I'm making eye contact with the webcam instead of eye contact with my picture of me, which is over here, and I need to be able to explain myself coherently. These are all skills, especially in the digital age, that will be very useful to you. So there are a lot of different forms of communication. I'll move my head out of the way just a little bit here, if it'll let me. I'm going to drag my head down here, if it'll let me. Some forms of communication are interpersonal, and inter, I-N-T-E-R, means between. So this is communication between people. Intrapersonal, which is your communication with yourself. That's internal communication. Interviewing. Most of us, when we graduate, are going to have to face some pretty fun job interviews, so the ability to represent yourself effectively there would be wonderful. Small group communication. I'm on a bunch of committees where I have to communicate effectively with groups of people at the same time. Public speaking, we've already mentioned, very crucial, being in front of people and at least pretending that you're confident, even if you don't feel like it. Computer communication, like right now. And then, of course, mass communication, which is communication to large amounts of people. So this would be something like newspapers, journals, TV, reporting, and if you have a hefty YouTube presence, that. So there are a lot of different components to communication. The figure in your textbook is really beneficial. If you have the ebook, they don't have page numbers, so you might have to scroll until you find figure 1.2. But the first element of communication would be the source. And for this example right now, that source would be me, because I am the one providing the communication. You, on the other end of the screencast, would represent the receiver, because you are receiving this information. The information that is being sent back and forth between source and receiver is the message. The channel is the method used to communicate. For example, right now I am using a screencast recording to communicate with you. I will also probably communicate with you using emails, D2L posts, grading feedback, comments, something like that. The channel could also be face-to-face. It could be texting. It could be writing a letter, if anybody still does that nowadays. So the channel is just how the information was communicated. Encoding is what the source does before they send out communication. That essentially means that your brain encodes what meaning it wants to transmit before it comes out of your face. So right now, as I'm doing the screencast, my brain is spinning, trying to find the most effective way to say what I want to say before that comes out of my mouth. For those of you that have very good speaking filters, that means you are a heavy encoder. You're encoding meaning before you let it come out of your face. If you're one of those that speak without thinking, then you probably need to boost your encoding skills just a little bit. Decoding is primarily what the listener does. Whenever they receive the information, they have to decode it to see if they interpreted it correctly. All of us have very diverse backgrounds and experiences, so the way that we interpret information is going to be very different. Something that might be interesting to me could be horrifically boring to you, and something that makes perfect sense to you could be completely confusing to me. So as listeners, we have to decode our messages. And then lastly, we have to provide some type of feedback which communicates whether or not we understand what we perceived. Now, my encouragement as the feedback stance is to always ask questions if you're not sure. We do live in a culture where people feel afraid to admit they don't understand something. Go ahead and say it. Is this what you meant? Check on it. And that's what I have to do all the time in my major relationships, because my brain decodes it 11 different ways, because that's how I'm trained to as a communicator. And sometimes I read way too much into something. There is the element of context that all communication happens within. And context is essentially the background situation that is housing or holding the communication. For right now, a very easy context could be the classroom context. And the context that you're in will shift the communication that you provide. For example, I would hope whenever you communicate with me via email or post that you write respectfully with appropriate grammar and are kind of formal with the way that you respond, because it's a different communication context. Whenever you're reaching out to your best friends, I completely expect you to have a totally different way of communicating with them, probably more informal or slang with your friends. There are a lot of different contexts. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is what we will use for now. The physical context is kind of like the classroom situation. It's what is physically around you. Right now I'm in my office, so I have no stimuli or feedback responding to how I'm communicating to you. So I'm clipping right through this without any pauses because I have nothing that's going to interfere with my communicating, unless someone knocks on the door. Cultural context would be, again, culture is the thoughts, attitudes, beliefs that influence our behavior. We are all raised to have different cultural backgrounds. For example, I was born and bred in Eastern Tennessee, and I'm still here, so I have a very mountain South culture. And mountain South is very different from deep South, like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, all of that. And it's very different from Northern culture. So the way that I communicate is heavily influenced by where I'm from. Social psychological context. This is kind of what's going on inside of your head. These are your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, and how those connect with other people. If you've ever been distracted by your own mind, that's what's going on there. If you've been having a very difficult time with life, your communication focus is probably not going to be as strong because that intrapersonal communication in your head is pulling your attention, I guess, away from the context. If you ever have had a friend that you can just tell is going through something, but you're not sure what, you're picking up on their psychological context. Temporal context has to deal with the time that is surrounding the situation. If you are in a rush, you are definitely going to communicate differently than if you have all the time in the world. Some of you are probably those people who can take 5 hours to explain a 2-minute story. And then the others of you are probably the people that could take 30 seconds to tell a 2-minute story. And it's just how you handle time and how that affects the way you communicate. Now, there are some basic communication principles that we all need to be aware of. This typically shows up on some exams, so ding, ding, ding. Communication is purposeful. This means that communication always has a point. It has a purpose. Think about it. Why do you communicate? It's typically to achieve something, whether that is entertaining someone or receiving information about something, or to warn someone that something's about to happen. But we always have a reason for communicating. Even if it's just being bored and we want to be entertained again, that's a purpose. Communication is also variable. That means it is changeable. It varies from person to person, from context to context, from culture to culture. Communication is always on the move. Almost no one communicates the same way all the time. We will change our communication based off of where we are at, who we are talking to, and how we feel that day. Communication is interpreted. We each have our own different lens through which we see the world. And you can think of it as the rose-tinted glasses, or the way that we see the world. So we are going to interpret communication very differently based off of how we hear it and what we think is important. A very easy example there is one of my friends had asked me to do something, and I responded with, "Sure, I don't care to do that." And around here, if you say, "I don't care to do that," that means, sure, fine, I'm fine with doing that. But his culture, if you say, "I don't care to do that," that means you do not want to do it. So he interpreted my meaning a little bit differently from how I intended it, which led to a much longer conversation later. Communication is inevitable. This means that it's going to happen no matter what. It is going to happen at some point. Even if you are curled up on the back of a bus with a hoodie pulled over your face and your arms crossed and your eyes closed, you're still communicating. You're communicating that you don't want to be bothered, but you're still communicating. And once we communicate, we can't take it back. So please be careful with what you say. Take some time to encode. Now, culture does affect our communication massively. We will talk about this. Your textbook has an amazing section on culture in this particular chapter, but we don't have enough time to go over it in the screencast. So please make sure that you do spend some time evaluating the culture section. Culture massively impacts how we communicate with each other. And as I always mentioned, or already mentioned earlier, culture is essentially how our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors influence how we communicate. It's what we value. Our culture is all about what we value. And we're affected by our culture because all of us individually have been brought up to value and believe in different ideas. And we, of course, use that in the way that we communicate with people. The respect that we show others, the disrespect that we show others, groups of people that we support or don't support. That's all something that kind of comes from the way we've been cultured. And a good thing about culture is that even though that's your background, that doesn't mean that's who you're going to be the rest of your life unless you choose for that to happen. So you can always adapt and kind of open up the way that your culture has raised you. Ethnocentrism, if we break that down, is ethnocentric. That means ethnicity center. My email alarm is going off over here. So with ethnocentrism, that essentially is when you believe that your communication is the best in the world, or that your culture is central to the world. It's kind of fun whenever you go through other people's, other countries' TV, and whenever they show a globe or a map, it's really fun to see which country is centered there. If you watch American television, it's always North America is dead center on the globe. If you watch European television, a lot of times, of course, Europe is going to be central on the map. And if you watch Asian TV, it's the same thing. It's whatever culture has put themselves center because of the communication. Now, ethnocentrism goes beyond pride. Being proud of your culture is a fine thing. That's wonderful. But ethnocentrism is when you take it a little bit too far and believe that your culture is best. Therefore, all other cultures are inferior or below you as a result. And that's not okay. So being proud of where you're from, that's good. We should have some pride in how we have been raised to communicate. Of course, we can improve on the communication no matter where we're from. But be very cautious about treating others as inferior to you. That's not a good way to start life. The last one here is your ethnic identity, and this is how you culturally identify yourself. What culture do you align with? For example, I identify with Southern mountain culture, even though people might make jokes about rednecks. That's my family, that's my culture. They might think that is inferior. I think that's just how the way that I've been raised in this area. If you think of jokes that people make about the South, it's NASCAR and biscuits and gravy and Southern hospitality. And that is a part of my ethnic identity. That is how I identify, or who I identify with. Now, the last thing to go over today, a couple of terms, and then we're going to be done. First is code switching. And code switching basically means you switch or change your method of communication based off of your context and your culture. For example, when I am teaching, I have a different voice. My register of my voice is down here as opposed to up here in a head voice. I use different vocabulary and I emphasize words differently, and I'm a little bit more formal. If I'm talking with my best friends, we could be busting out laughing. There might be slang used. There is a completely different type of communicating. And then if I go visit my parents, different communicating again. A good example would be my grandparents are very truly Southern people, and they have the truly Southern dialogue or accent. So when I go visit them, I use my full Tennessee accent. Whenever I'm teaching, I have less of an accent. It's still there, but it's not anywhere as strong. I have switched my code. Cultural awareness, we've already emphasized a little bit. Making sure that you are a competent communicator means that you are going to be aware of the cultural diversity around you and able to code switch accordingly. Lastly, ethical behavior is one of the best things we can have to be competent communicators. This means that we are respectful, we do honor the diversity, and that we don't lie. You have to be honest, you have to be respectful, and you have to be aware in order to be able to communicate competently with other people. And when I say honesty, honesty should be blended with respect. Use your encoding and be aware of the different communication tactics. So that is your flying fast moving through screencast. I'm going to hit it right at 20 minutes, and I'm so proud. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.